Hi class, in this video we're going to cover briefly the short article on Jeremy Bentham from the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Let me say a few things as reminders. First of all, hopefully you remember from the utilitarianism overview that Bentham is a hedonic act utilitarian. Always keep that in mind because that's going to get us in the ballpark. Act utilitarian says apply the utility principle on an act-by-act basis, so act so as to increase or maximize utility. He's also a hedonic utilitarian, which is to say that all goods are comparable. And we'll see why immediately. Notice he introduces a unit of happiness. He calls it a hedon. That's misleading because there's a different view called hedonism that is not his view. So nowadays it's going to be called a util, U-T-I-L. That's a measure of happiness or unhappiness. And we'll get back to that in a minute. But for now, I just want to mention a few other things. First of all, notice the very title of the work, Principles of Morals and Legislation. One of the things that people find attractive about utilitarianism is even though it's not legality, it very easily translates from one to the other, that we can very easily make laws that benefit everyone or maximize benefit for the society, etc. And you see Bentham talking about how the legislator has only utility to work with. We can't legislate based on people's intent or character or anything like that. So that's just an aside. That's a nice utilitarianism view. For fun, stop and think. Do we have any laws based on utilitarianism? Yes. I dare say that probably our traffic laws are rule utilitarian in nature. If you want to pause and think about that. Having said that, are we a utilitarian society? Absolutely not. We think that there are intrinsic rights that effectively ignore consequences and principles of utility. But more on that in the recitation. But for now, remember how we're treating the Bentham reading. Bentham is helping us get into a utilitarian mindset. We're really bad, by we I mean human beings, including myself. We're really bad at thinking about all consequences. And so sometimes we need some sort of method or procedure by which to really think through all probable consequences. As I mentioned in the last video, we tend to focus on the consequences for ourselves, or the short-term consequences, or the consequences of those in our immediate circle, etc. But we have to think of all consequences. And once we do that, things that we don't even think of as matters of ethics all of a sudden have moral ramifications. So let's say you go to a restaurant and you're choosing between the turkey sandwich and the BLT. Is that moral? In the sense that does the decision matter to ethics? If you're a utilitarian, yes. And I'm not even bringing animal ethics into it, but just the very fact that how the meat is raised has utilitarian consequences. So, for instance, if the pork is factory farmed, pig factory farms are ecological time bombs, which cause all sorts of health risks to those who live near the factory farms. And so part of the consequence of your ordering the BLT might very well be contributing to the childhood leukemia of someone who lives nearby. And so things we just don't even think of as ethics normally, Bentham's going to say, no, wait, hold on. You have to think through all the consequences of your actions. That might seem daunting, but let's talk about some kind of shortcuts and things to look for to help us do it well. And I think that's the best way to read the Bentham. The best use for the Bentham reading. That's not necessarily what he was intending, but it's really going to help us think about all probable consequences. And so we could do this in a couple of ways. We could do it mathematically, or we could do it more generally. Bentham gives you the full tools if you want to actually do the math. You can calculate utility. This is a utility calculus. For really important decisions, I actually strongly recommend that. So, if you're, for instance, thinking about which grad school to go to, really in-depth utility calculus might be appropriate there. Having said that, we're not going to do a whole lot of mathematical examples, but how might we do that? As I already mentioned, Bentham introduces a unit of pleasure or displeasure called we will call it a util. Um, how do we think about a unit of pleasure or displeasure? It's not as hard as you think. And we have things like we have units for how hot a pepper is. It's not that hard to come up with a unit of happiness. Um, the important part though is just staying objective about it. So here's how I like to think of a unit of happiness. I like to think of one positive util, that is a +1, as the amount of happiness I would gain in finding a dollar. By contrast, I think of a negative util as the happiness I would lose, or unhappiness I would gain, either way, in losing $1. Not spending, losing. And if you think of it that way, it really starts to be pretty easy to convert these things. So let's say I have a massive headache. Well, how much negative utility is that? Well, how many dollars would you spend to not have the headache? If you could pay, $70 to get rid of the headache, would you? And if you start thinking that way consistently, it becomes very easy to get into kind of the utilitarian process of thinking objectively about utility. Now, you might have a couple of concerns right away. You might say, wait a minute, Nikki. I'm a poor college student and you're a professor. Doesn't that mean the dollar values are going to be different for us? Yes. But in an important sense, that doesn't matter. Why doesn't that matter? What matters is that you use the measure objectively. So, um, by analogy, if I'm measuring my height in centimeters and you're measuring my height in inches, well, there's going to be some conversionary work, but that certainly doesn't change my height. We could still talk meaningfully about the objective height of Mickey Larkowski. Very similarly, well, if the way you think about a util is larger than the way I think about a util, that's okay as long as you use it consistently. So there's no problem in doing that. So that's how I like to think of utils. Notice it does a lot of stuff. So for instance, if I'm trying to decide between two cars, it's very easily to just convert dollars to utils if this one costs more or less, or uses more gas, etc. So think of utils objectively, and that's a great start. Then what do we do? Bentham says we need to consider 7 points. And what are these 7 points? More importantly, what are they doing? You should think of these as the kind of things we need to think about if we're thinking about all utility. So I'm going to use an example of just a really, really basic thing right here. Because to understand that any action has a lot of repercussions for people. And so just pretend for a minute it's a normal semester and you're attending in class, and you might do a utility calculus of what is the utility of going to class, total utility, not my utility. And so we'll think of that as an example as we go through these. So when we're making the decision, the first one Bentham says is intensity. That is intensity of the pleasure or displeasure. So what would that mean in the class example? We're talking about just the pleasure or displeasure of sitting through one of Mickey's lectures. You've already sat through a bunch of video ones. So forget things like the exam, graduating, all that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actual pleasure or displeasure of attending one of Mickey's lectures. How do we think about that? Well, use the little conversion I just taught you. If the Mickey lecture was instead a movie, how much would you pay for a ticket? So this is obviously assuming you actually enjoy my lectures. You don't have to. It's fine. So let's say I enjoy Mickey's lectures a little bit. I would pay $5 to attend this semi-boring lecture as a movie. Um, then that gives you the intensity of the pleasure. That's your basic. That's your starting point. If you dislike Mickey lectures, again, not talking about, well, I could be doing something else with my hour. We're talking about actual sitting through this makes me not want to do, makes me uncomfortable and unhappy. Then you might have a negative utility as a start. Say, well, I dislike them, but I don't hate them. I would pay $10 to not have to sit here and suffer through this. Then it's negative 10 utility. So that's the intensity, just the raw pleasure or displeasure we're talking about. All goods and bads come in degrees. So think of the amount of pleasure you gain from a turkey sandwich versus your favorite meal. I'll stop doing these lectures before lunch. But anyway, that's what we're talking about. Oh, and by the way, I hope you notice Bentham uses utility in the broad sense. Anything that increases pleasure, happiness, benefit has utility. So, for instance, there's a sense in which my little masks here on the wall don't actually do anything. They just sit there, but they make me happy. I enjoy looking at them. And so that would be useful or utility in the utilitarian sense. And notice we see that when it talks about intensity. Well, what intensity of pleasure do I get for looking at my African masks? So, very, very broad notion of utility is what matters here. The second category he gives is duration. This is really to recognize the utilitarian importance of short-term versus long-term. Um, some pleasures last a lot longer and some displeasures last a lot longer, and that's really important to take care of. We're not puppies, we're humans, we're long-term thinkers. So, for instance, I might not have wanted to shoot a video today during my vacation, but um, in the long run, that would cause me more negative utility if I didn't do it. That's actually a little bit of a bad example. That's more of another category. But take maybe a better example. Think of a headache versus a broken limb. I have headaches. I've had broken bones, and I've had migraines. And migraines hurt way more, believe it or not. If So just as a side note, if you say, well, a lot of people say they have migraines and they just mean a bad headache. If your head hurts less than a broken back, it's probably not a migraine. But anyway, what's the difference there? Yeah, I've had both of those. The migraine lasts maybe a day. The broken back pain lasts much longer. And so even though the intensity of the migraine is worse, the overall negative utility of the pain of the broken back, more negative utility. And so we have to take into account duration. If you're doing this mathematically, that's a multiplier. You know, just add. If going back to our example of going to one lecture, it's a multiplier of 1. If you're talking about 5 lectures, well, multiply it by 5, etc. Next one, very, very, very important, is likelihood. When I teach the critical thinking class, one of the first things we learn, all value is probable value. If you have an 80% chance of making $50, you shouldn't treat that as $50. You should treat it as 80% of $50 or $40. This is not, this is not intended to be sneaky. This is how we already operate in life. That well, if I have a small chance of hugely negative consequences, that's still bad because the consequences are hugely negative. If I have a small chance of getting run over by a car walking crossing the street, I probably won't cross the street because even though it's a small chance, the consequences are so huge. So, uh, well, to just take some simple numbers, if it's negative a million utils to get hit by a car, and I have a 1% chance of getting hit by a car, then you should treat that as negative. Oh gosh, why did I do that? 10,000 utils. Point being, it's unpleasant, and the same goes for positive. If the positive utility gained is not certain, then you can't compute it as if it were certain. So imagine how foolish it would be as if I walked around treating my lottery ticket like I was a guaranteed winner. What kind of an imbecile would I be there? So we have to take into account likelihood of all utility. So let's say you're computing, again, the original example is how much utility is gained or lost by going to a Mickey Lurkowski lecture on campus in a normal semester. You'd have to say, well, if I normally get 5 positive utils from a Mickey lecture, but that's not guaranteed. Say sometimes he's a little off his game or the subject matter is a little more boring, and that happens once in a while. Let's say it happens 1 out of every 5 times. I only gain 3 utils. Then you would have to do 4/5 times 5 plus 1/5 times 3. Sorry. Anyway, again, you are not going to ever have to compute one of these mathematically if you don't want to. I just want to kind of give you what's there and available because it really can help your life. If you really have an important decision, get as precise mathematically as possible for these things. And certainly if you're a legislator, like Bentham was suggesting, you better be doing this kind of stuff. And if you don't feel like thinking through all the consequences, don't be a legislator. But anyway, next one is remoteness. If you're writing these down, put that in some brackets or something, because here's a funny thing. Um, Bentham is the only utilitarian who includes remoteness on the list. Everyone pretty much says it either shouldn't be there or worse, putting it there actually causes problems for utilitarianism, and we'll see that come through a little later. So what is remoteness? How near a good is? I don't even, yeah, it's hard to come up with an example that's charitable to Bentham here. You might think, well, children dying on the other side of the world is just as bad as children dying next to me. If you think that, then you kind of agree that we should set remoteness aside. Uh, let's just leave remoteness off the list. Sorry, Bentham, you were awesome overall. We'll forgive you that one. Let's talk about the next one. The next really important good is fecundity or productivity. Now, what's fecundity? What does that mean? Does this good produce other goods or other bads? Or does this bad produce other goods or other bads? So, the reason most of you attend lecture isn't because of my wonderful lecturing and it's like a movie. The reason you attend lecture is all the other goods associated with it. Doing well on the class, graduating, that kind of thing. Not feeling guilty might be a fecundity. All of these things besides the actual original good that we started with. And so fecundity comes up a ton because, again, just about everything you do has tons and tons and tons of consequences. So going back to the sandwich eating example, a fecundity a bad produced might be contributing to the health problems of people living near the factory farm. That's a fecundity. Or, the carbon emission and damage to the environment from your driving a car is a fecundity. And so those are the ones that you really have to do a lot. And it's a lot more math. Basically, you have to treat each of those as a good or a bad and do the computation total if you're doing it mathematically. A really good exercise overall, it just has to do with thinking through all the effects. And I'll talk about a few examples you might want to do on the discussion board at the end of this when we go through. But fecundity is the one you really have to focus on because that's the one people tend to forget about. Purity is an important one. I'm not aware of anything that is all and entirely good or all and entirely bad. So to take an extreme example, last lecture I mentioned Albert Fish, who has my vote for worst human being of all time. Well, is there anything salvageable or good about his actions? Sure, he makes a great example for ethics lectures. Um, so when even the actions of Albert Fish have some good to them, we really need to pay attention and make sure we're talking about all the goods and bads. Um, think about Unit 1 and some of the kind of bad and caricature arguments for and against abortion. If you say, well, there's absolutely nothing good about abortion or absolutely nothing bad about abortion, you're just being biased. You're being wildly biased. And so one of the reasons of really bringing purity to mind, again, this is why we're looking at the Bentham reading, is to realize, well, am I really thinking it through? Am I thinking about the good and the bad of this particular action, etc.? And um, so don't forget your purity. Sorry, that just sounds really weird, but don't forget the category of purity. It's come with good and bad. Uh, extent is really important because that's how we move from egoists to utilitarians. Extent is the number of people affected, not just for me, but for everybody. So first of all, let me pause there. If you want to do a utility calculus just of how it affects me, that's useful in some ways. Just be aware that you're using a tool of utilitarianism rather than being a utilitarian. So the example I already gave of if you want to do a utility calculus for a major decision, such as whether you should go to this grad school or this grad school, that you probably drop extent off of there if you want. If you're only interested in how it benefits you, that's okay. Just be aware you're using utilitarian tools for non-utilitarian things. The utilitarian must consider the impact to everybody. And then Bentham says we sum and balance. Let me say a few things about the sum and balance. One, you could really do it mathematically if you want. So how do we do that? Intensity is your basic number, duration's a multiplier, likelihood's a percentage multiplier. Um, Fecundity is just plus and minus these additional goods that you also do an intensity, duration, likelihood of. Purity, you just have to subtract. So if it's not all good, you have to subtract the bad, etc. And then extent is a multiplier for the number of people affected. Again, I'm not going to ask you to do any mathematics on this. You're certainly welcome to, even in the discussion boards. If you want to try to do a mathematical one, go for it. If you get really good at mathematizing utility calculus, you could actually do some cool things in maximizing the benefit and just leading a better life and maximizing your happiness. So it's definitely a worthwhile exercise. Just not a math class, and I'm not going to force you to do it overall. I say overall because I might ask you like a really basic one on the exam. But how do we sum and balance? A couple of ways. First of all, if we're deciding between two actions, such as which grad school to go to, do the utility calculus. Whichever one has higher utility, do it. However, suppose you do a utility calculus and they both have negative utility. Then you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do either option. Roughly speaking, if it's negative, that is utilitarian bad or impermissible. If it's positive, that's utilitarian good. If it's zero, that's utilitarian neutral. There are some neutral acts, but they're rare. So anytime you're increasing utility, utilitarian is going to give you the thumbs up. However, there's a difference between increasing and maximizing. So you might think of maximizing utility as supererogatory, kind of the above and beyond, etc. So that's what we do. And if you want, here's some really interesting utility calculus ones. It's somehow become a cultural thing in the U.S. to Uh, some people think that we shouldn't be wearing masks during COVID. Do a utility calculus of a mask. Do some, if you want some good practice before you get a nut, just do a utility calculus of an everyday thing. Like, whether I should use my blinker or not is kind of a funny one. It ends up with a lot of likelihood and vicinity issues. Or just any everyday activity you'd like to do, or a comparison of two. Uh, it's really good to kind of walk before you run if you want to do a discussion board just about here's a very basic thing and here's the utility calculus, or between these two options, here's the utility calculus. But if you want to do a more fun one, yeah, do something like wearing a mask or things like that. I'll tip my hand here and just tell you there's quite a few issues in the U.S., as I already mentioned. U.S. is not a utilitarian society. And so things like not wearing a mask will come out with huge negative utility. But in the U.S., to go um, back to the Jarvis-Thompson discussion, this is exactly a benefit versus rights issue. Um, the level of gun permissibility we have will come out as a negative utility, but it's a benefit versus rights issue. So you'll find several of those if you want to do some of the more interesting topics. They're going to be about what you expect. um, but Jarvis Thompson said rights trump benefits, and that seems to be how we think about a lot of these things. And but it's interesting to think on the other side. Well, what would happen if we decided benefit trumped rights? So there are some things that utilitarianism can really help us on, though. Um, for instance, there's kind of some that just if we just stick to utility, it becomes a no-brainer. Capital punishment is one of those for reasons we can talk about in the recitation if you'd like. But that's the general idea overall. So once more, what we're doing with the Bentham, we're just trying to practice thinking through this big, vague concept of all probable utility, because that's what the utilitarian must consider, and it's something we're bad at. And so great discussion boards, just pick an action, try to talk about all the possible utility. Now, you don't have to do the calculus, you could just say things like, well, I'd have to consider things like where the meat was raised and how it got to just show me that you're aware of the kind of things we have to investigate. That's all we're looking for. And then a great response post, if you want to, helpful to your classmates, I could virtually guarantee that they miss some because it's really hard to think about all consequences. And so help your classmates politely, tactfully, and conforming to web etiquette. Well, did they? Which utility considerations did they forget? So this is a really helpful exercise, even if you're not a full-blown utilitarian at the end of the semester. And just the very exercise and importance of at least thinking through all the consequences before you act is hugely important to ethics. And so, if nothing else, please use it that way. All right. What are we going to talk about next time is the SMART reading. Again, SMART is going to do something a little different. He's going to talk about the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism in different language. And he's going to argue for one over the other. And so we will see you next time.